This is Debbie Georgiani. Thank you for listening to the Station of the Cross, proclaiming the fullness of truth with clarity and charity.
Heard around the world on your Android and Apple mobile devices.
The Simple Truth, rising up to explore the difficult topics of real life. Join us as we proclaim the good, the true, and the beautiful with the simple truth of Jesus Christ and His Holy Catholic Church through Scripture, tradition, and the Catechism. And now, your host, Jim Havens.
It is great to be back with you on The Simple Truth. We consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the Pure Strong Heart of St. Joseph. Today is Testimony Tuesday, where we bring you real, live, first-hand testimonial accounts of the life-giving reality of Jesus and His Catholic Church. Our guest today is Phil Lawler. He is a Catholic husband, father, and grandfather, a prolific author of many essays, articles, and books, including Contagious Faith, Why the Church Must Spread Hope, Not Fear in a Pandemic. He's also founder and editor of Catholic World News, the first English-language Catholic news service operating on the internet, which he founded in 1995, and which provides daily headline news coverage for CatholicCulture.org. There is so much in Phil's biography, so much good work that he's been a part of. So we do pray that the Holy Spirit would help Phil to lift out the highlights, that we could get as much in as we can today. Phil Lawler, thank you for being with us. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, Jim, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I understood. You reeled me in for this program by telling me that you wanted me to tell stories, and my wife will tell you. She knows that I love to tell stories.
Perfect. Yes, and we had Lila on, your wife Lila Lawler, about a year ago, I think March of last year, sitting in the hot seat right where you are, sharing some stories on the faith and her testimony, which was a great treat. Folks can go back and find that in the podcast. But Phil, we always begin at the beginning here, so let's start with childhood. What was your early life like? Your family, the culture that you grew up in?
I grew up in a big, fairly happy Catholic family. We were raised as Catholic. My parents were fairly devout. There were 6 children. It was, I would say, upper middle class. I went to Catholic schools for the first 12 years. It was not much drama. That was somewhat conventional Catholic upbringing. I was pretty active in the faith. I was an altar boy. This is in the days before Vatican II. I was a master of ceremonies. I enjoyed that. The sisters in grammar school all figured that I was going to be a priest. I think, honestly, they thought that because I did well in school, which is a non sequitur. But that was all pretty conventional, I would say, through up until somewhere in my high school years when things got more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and was it a culture? So before Vatican II, Boston, Massachusetts area, was it something where you're growing up, and it just seems like the faith is everywhere, and that everybody's kind of on the same page, and that this is the real deal. Jesus and His Catholic Church, of course, this is real. Of course, I'm going to say yes and live this life. It was kind of just you're soaking in it. Is that sort of how it was, or was it clear that
yes,
there were different choices to make? Go ahead.
No, that was pretty much how it was. I lived in an Irish Catholic neighborhood predominantly. I was somewhat unusual in that my best friend was a Protestant. Mm-hmm. I had friends as late as high school who did not know a Protestant. So yeah, I was soaked in that culture in my youth.
Yeah, thanks be to God. All right, well, tell us about the high school years. What happened there?
Vatican II happened, and the aftermath of Vatican II happened. My freshman year in high school, the religion class was about the Old Testament, and it was pretty good. It was a competitive high school. We were fairly demanding in most of our subjects. We learned Latin. And the religion course, as I say, was a pretty good course. We learned quite a bit about the Old Testament. sorry to say, much of it has floated out of my ears in the almost 60 years since then. But sophomore year, the course was going to be the New Testament, and this was in the immediate aftermath of Vatican II, and lots of people had bright ideas. Well, long story short, we didn't study the New Testament in any depth, and by junior year, we were talking about our feelings, and the rigor with which the faith had been treated in my freshman year completely disappeared, so that by my senior year in high school, the religion class was frankly a joke. And it contrasted so sharply with the relative rigor with which we were studying other things, English and math and history and so forth, that I was encouraged to take my faith lightly at exactly the point where you don't want a young man to be taking his faith lightly. When you're coming of age and having the usual temptations that come with adolescence and growing into manhood, that was not a message that I needed, and it was really disastrous for my faith.
All right, yeah. Tell us more then. How did that mix in also as you're growing older in those high school years and trying to figure out what you're going to do after high school? And I guess, yeah, how did that all play together? What happened next?
Well, I mean, to simplify things, sorry to say, I lost my faith. I was not functionally a Catholic by the time I left high school. I occasionally put up the facade. I still believed in God. I would sometimes go to church, to satisfy my parents. And I suppose there was some emotion still there, but I can't say that I was an active believer through the end of my high school, through my college years, and up until I went to grad school when I had a reawakening in the faith. It wasn't a significant factor in my life. I suppose I should say that I am grateful that some of the instincts that I was brought up with stayed with me, if you know what I mean. That there were things that I just wasn't going to do, not because I had an active faith, not because my conscience was very demanding of me. It certainly wasn't, but it seemed like bad form. If I can tell a story about somebody else, because it sort of explains the way I felt. I have a friend, just now deceased, wonderful man, who was in the Navy in World War II. And he was stationed in San Diego, and some of the fellows who were in his unit were going to go down to Tijuana on the weekend and, go drinking and chasing girls. And he at the time was feeling his wild oats. And he didn't want to go with them. And he asked himself, why don't I want to go with them on this, journey into sin in Mexico? And he said the answer was, this isn't something people in my family do. And I guess I felt a little bit like that. And those instincts did serve me well to some extent through my college years. Not well enough to keep me out of trouble, but they kept me out of some trouble.
Sure. So at this time, there was a change in the culture, a change in the Catholic culture, a change, as you mentioned, in the way that education was taking place, even at that level. So were you just kind of being sort of washed along that stream with all of this, or was there anything big intellectually, or any big obstacle to the faith that emerged, or was it really kind of just like a cultural sway?
It was a cultural sway. It was a personal sway. As I say, I was not exempt from the temptations the young men suffer. I went through college, secular college. I went to Harvard in the 4 craziest years of the student rebellion from 68 through 72. So that 2 of those 4 years, the academic year didn't even end because of student strikes. It was a wild time. again, I have to be honest and tell you that my faith was not a major factor in my thinking at that time, but a lot of thinking went on. You couldn't go through that time and that school without doing some soul searching. One thing that was consistent through then and all of my adult life and a little before I was an adult, if I'm an adult yet, sometimes I wonder, is that I was always resistant to liberalism. I was in an environment in a college where liberals dominated, and I didn't like it. So maybe that too was partly my instinct that survived from my Catholic childhood. It was certainly affected by my studies because I was reading all sorts of liberal stuff and not buying it. I feel like, Harvard had 4 years to convert me and failed. So I don't want to go back to reunions and go to seminars and give them another chance. But does that answer your question? It was a crazy time in my life and in the life of the country and of the church.
Right. Yeah. Any other stories that stand out to you from that time that would, I guess, help us to understand? Well, I guess when we get back from the break, we'll ask you that question. Any other stories from that experience? That is a unique experience. Not that many people, I would imagine, obviously in the student body at Harvard from 1968 till 1972, that are faithful Catholics today that are around to tell the tale. So we'll see what emerges in Phil's memory that he can share with us when we get back. So much upheaval since that time, so much in the culture that has gone upside down since those times. It's important that we grapple with that. It's important that we understand that. It's important that people share the stories from those times that they are aware of, and that we can try to figure out how we can restore the Catholic culture in whatever ways we can in our own families, moving outward into the community. We'll be right back with Phil Lawler. Stay tuned.
This is Franciscan Media's Saint of the Day for February 7th. Today we celebrate Saint Colette. A quiet life of prayer and devotion was Colette's path to sanctity. Born in France in 1381, Colette lived the life of a hermit following her father's death. She followed the third rule of St. Francis and became a so-called anchoress, a woman walled into a room whose only opening was a window into a church. She developed a reputation for holiness, and many people went to her for spiritual direction. After 4 years, Colette left her tiny cell and, with the encouragement of the Pope, joined the Poor Clares. Serving as abbess general, she began the work of restoring the primitive rule of St. Clare in the 17 monasteries she established. Though she met with some initial opposition, the reform movement took root in France and spread elsewhere as well. She and her sisters became known for their poverty and fasting. Colette began her reform during the time of the Great Western Schism, where 3 men claimed to be pope, and Western Christianity was deeply divided. Her efforts were aimed at reminding not just the Poor Clares, but also the entire church, of the need to follow Christ more closely. She died in 1447. There's more about the saints along with inspiration and Catholic resources at our website, saintoftheday.org. From Franciscan Media, this has been Saint of the Day.
Our bumper magnets are a great way to promote the gospel as proclaimed through Catholic radio. We hear all the time from new listeners who were introduced to the station through a bumper magnet. We'd be happy to send you a bumper magnet so that others can come to know our Lord. Just go to thestationofthecross.com and find our bumper magnet request button under the About tab. That's thestationofthecross.com under the About tab.
Back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here on this Testimony Tuesday with our guest today, Phil Lawler. He's a Catholic husband, father, and grandfather. He's the author of many essays, articles, and books, founder and editor of Catholic World News, which provides daily headline news coverage for CatholicCulture.org. And before the break in the first segment, Phil was sharing with us about his being born and raised in the Boston area, attending Harvard, and also he graduated with honors in government in 1972. So he was there in 1968, 1972. Phil, anything else from those Harvard years that stands out to you that's worth mentioning before we connect those dots to the reversion time or moment?
Well, nothing too much involving myself, but since you said you wondered how many faithful Catholics came out of that class. Let me just tell you something about classmates of mine. They include John Kavanagh O'Keefe, who was one of the founders of the rescue movement. The late Rich Collier, who was one of the lawyers who was instrumental in protecting pro-life activists before he died much too soon. My roommate Dave Kavanaugh is now a Catholic priest of Opus Dei. Frank McNamara, who's a couple of years ahead of me, I see him at Mass every day now. He's a former U.S. attorney in Boston. Mike Cook, who is now the editor of Mercatornet, which is roughly a little bit like the Australian version of Catholic World News. Alan Keyes, who was a presidential candidate a few years ago, is a classmate of mine. So it's surprising how many people came through, one way or another, probably with scars.
And as you mentioned, some of those names and the good work that they've done, the pro-life activity comes up, and that certainly is an interesting link here. You graduated in 1972, Roe v. Wade coming down in 73. That had to be significant at that time in life, right after graduation. So anything you want to share, I guess, about that aspect of upheaval in the culture, and yeah, definitely want to connect the dots to your reversion as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to come back to the pro-life movement because that was a very important factor for me, but it weighed in a little later.
Okay.
What brought me back, or started me on a long road back to the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith, was really intellectual. I was, after graduation from Harvard, I went to the University of Chicago and I was studying political theory, really political philosophy. And I honestly don't know what it was I was reading. I don't recall what I was reading in Aristotle, but I had been told that the best way to understand Aristotle, whatever it was I was reading, whatever passage, whatever Aristotle was writing about that I wanted to dig into some more. The best way to understand it was to read St. Thomas Aquinas, and I had not read St. Thomas, and so this was a new experience for me. And I dug into it, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this man didn't just answer my question, the question that brought me to his book. He answered half a dozen other questions that I wasn't smart enough even to ask." And I recognized, okay, this is a superior intellect. I'll tell you, people come out of Harvard are pretty arrogant, and I'm no exception. So it isn't often that I just say, wow, this man is much smarter than I am. I need to pay attention to him. Well, when you're dealing with St. Thomas Aquinas, if you pay any attention to him, you can't get past the fact that he is a Catholic. That he's writing about the faith. And so I told you earlier that I came out of high school thinking that the faith wasn't intellectually serious. Well, this was a slap in the face. And that really got me started on the way back. And it took me a long way, and it took me a long while to get all the way back, because it takes a long while to break down pride, frankly. And yet that was crucial to me, was recognizing. And then from St. Thomas, I went to St. Augustine, I went to Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, a lot of Catholic intellectuals who I had to take seriously. And I said, okay, well, in a sense, I said, I was robbed, because I should have been introduced to these people much earlier, but I wasn't. Thank God I came across them when I did. And I have to say, one of these things I don't think is a coincidence. I had a grandmother who was a wonderful, pious Catholic woman who lived with us when I was a child and who I loved very much, and she spoiled me. And this sort of the beginning of my reversion occurred right after she died. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's a grace that she put in a good word for me.
Wow. Yes, yeah. Thanks be to God. So we are on holy ground here with Phil Lawler. He's sharing some of his personal testimony with us. All right, Phil, what happened next? What else would you like to share?
Okay, it's a lot of ground to cover, so little ground, so little time. I left grad school. I decided I was better equipped for journalism than for scholastic life, academic life, and I'm happy that I made that decision when I did. And I found my way to New Jersey, where I was working on a magazine, and it was productive, and I was also getting closer and closer to the faith, and I met a young woman who was, for the first time, becoming interested, who was a genuine convert, and that, of course, is my wife, Lila. And it's funny because we were both approaching Catholicism from different directions. She had never been brought up in any faith and was finding her way to the one true faith. I was brought up as a Catholic and was finding my way back, and we ended up in the same place, married in the church, and thank God for that.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Yeah. Again, I would point people to, as a companion to this, to go back to the podcast that we did with Lila Lawler back in March of 2022. She is prolific in her own right, in the good work that she has done, her writings, and I think people will really find it a treat to listen to her and the stories that she has to share. Yeah, coming from a very, her story coming from a very different way, but yeah, you two coming together, God bringing it all together, and then what happens next from there? So we've got a new Catholic family here that God has established with you two. How did it go forward?
Okay, let's see. I was pursuing a career in political journalism. I was at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. I was also becoming more active in my faith. My prayer life was expanding. And, I'm going to have to go back now. I'm sorry, I left something very important out.
Sure.
Which is when I was in grad school, when I was just beginning to rediscover my faith. And I was praying, and I was praying in a very odd way. I was meditating, not transcendental meditation, just sitting there trying to be at one with the universe or whatever. And but with a sense of the Christian God that I was trying to reach. And I had some really extraordinary experiences, which I can't honestly explain in words, but at that point I was more sure that God existed than that I existed, and it was a feeling of unbelievable joy, and so that was certainly an impetus to my conversion. And I it's impossible to articulate what was happening, but if it happens to you, you know it. And I read some of St. Teresa of Avila and some of St. John of the Cross, and I understood what they were talking about. Not that I had the same sort of experiences, certainly not that I had the same sort of profound encounter with our Lord, but for sure he was calling me. No question about that.
Wow, well, that's helpful. Yeah.
It sure was. It was a great grace, great blessing. And that's got to be the result of prayer and somebody else's prayer, because I wasn't doing enough myself. And it's also a reminder that, our Lord is the lover and we are the beloved. He comes to us. We don't go to him first. That's not the way, it's never the way it works. We respond to him. But anyway, so that's in my background. I'm coming back to the faith. I'm becoming a more recognizably practicing Catholic. And I was writing a lot, and I was writing mostly about economics. But I also started writing a bit about the faith. I was writing for the National Catholic Register at that time. And here's the funny thing. When I was writing about economics, I was telling people, trust the free market. The free market knows what it's doing. Then when I was writing about the faith, I noticed it sold. The free market was telling me something. And I say, trust the free market. Well, then I said, the free market is telling me I should be writing more about my faith. So I started writing more about my faith. I started being more active about my faith. This was around the time, now we're up to 1983, say. Mm-hmm. And again, skipping quickly through a lot. And 1983 is when the U.S. bishops were working on that pastoral letter on nuclear weapons. And here I was in a political environment, and I said to myself, there are real problems with this letter, not that the bishops are opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, which are immoral and cannot be justified in blowing up cities, but the way they're phrasing this letter, it looks simply like an endorsement of the movement that was then known as the nuclear freeze, which I opposed. And many of us who were in the conservative political movement also opposed it. Well, I found that there was no sort of organized movement at that time to have a voice giving a conservative alternative to what looked like a politically liberal stance that the U.S. bishops were taking. So, make a long story short, I organized one, and I found, once again, there were a lot of people out there who were interested in hearing this. So that's how I became sort of a professional Catholic. I didn't want to. I didn't want to make my living as a Catholic. But as I say, the free market told me that's the way I should do it, that people were interested in hearing what I had to say. Yes. And so I became, I was editor of Crisis magazine, which at the time was based in South Bend. And then I went to the Boston Pilot, which is the archdiocesan newspaper. And that's a good point. That's a good point in my life to begin the next segment, I guess.
Excellent. Yeah, great jumping off point as we head into the next segment after the break. In the meantime, as we head into the break, I guess I would just want to double back to what Phil was sharing about that encounter with Almighty God, as he was simply opening himself up and directing himself, orienting himself in some way to God, to the Christian God, as he says. And look, if we just make a little step in his direction, especially in those beginning moments or those coming back moments, it's like the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son. He will run to us, right? He is calling us. Let us say yes. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
This is Life News Radio. I'm Jim Anderson. The U.S. House last week authorized subcommittee investigation into weaponization of the federal government against pro-life advocates. Just last week, a judge told federal prosecutors that charges against a pro-life Pennsylvania man were a stretch. And then the jury concurred. Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio will call the committee into session Thursday. On the other side of Congress, Senate Republicans are introducing a bill to stop U.S. tax-funded abortion in other countries. Dr. Michael New of the Lawler Institute says a recent study in the journal Contraception should interest pro-lifers. Strong statistical evidence shows pro-life pregnancy centers offer better and less expensive services than abortion facilities. This is Life News Radio. Life News Radio should make you think, and often it should make you think about calling your elected officials in Washington, D.C. Let your senators, your representatives, hear from you. 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121. Attorneys for Planned Parenthood are touting a win in court, but the so-called losers, a Spokane Covenant Church, says they are willing to pay nearly $1 million in legal fees, agree to change service hours, and start church services again outside a Spokane Planned Parenthood next month. In other headlines, Oregon, with legalized early death, is promoting tourism for suicide visits. The Associated Press is compelling writers to call pregnancy support centers anti-abortion centers. And an Idaho boy was born last month as if showing his determination to be born. Viral video shows him grasping his mother's would-be lethal IUD. For pro-life headlines delivered to your email address daily, sign up at lifenews.com. This has been Life News Radio.
Back to the Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Phil Lawler, our guest today on this Testimony Tuesday. Phil is a Catholic husband, father, grandfather, author of many essays, articles, books, including Contagious Faith, Why the Church Must Spread Hope, Not Fear in a Pandemic. He's also founder and editor of Catholic World News, providing daily headline news coverage for CatholicCulture.org. Phil, after right at the end of the last segment there, sharing that you became editor of the Boston Pilot, 1986, I believe, the Archdiocese of Boston. So go ahead and take it from there.
Well, that was great at first. I was editor of the Archdiocesan newspaper in my hometown. I was very comfortable. Boston is a very small city for a big city. I was welcomed back. I felt like I knew everybody. We spoke the same way. Spoke the same language with the same accent. You know, the Red Sox won the World Series eventually. And I was pretty happy there. My family was growing. But be candid with you, the clergy of the Archdiocese of Boston wasn't very happy with me. I was too controversial, and I didn't last very long. I was fired after about 2 years. And at about the same time that I was being fired, and, you know, being fired for being too Catholic, being too outspoken in your Catholicism, being fired from a Catholic newspaper for that offense tends to radicalize you. And at the same time, I was becoming involved in Operation Rescue. And I became the public spokesman for Operation Rescue in Boston for a while. At a time when this movement was booming. I was arrested a few times. I saw there people who were living out their faith in a radical way that I didn't see in other places. I mean, I don't mean to say that it's the only place people were living out their faith in that full radical commitment. I just mean these people were. And it was evident. They were ready to pay a price. And that was a tremendous influence in my life, and a very positive influence. And as I say, the combination of those events radicalized me and made me think, okay, I'm not going to compromise. I'm going to be out there, out front with my faith, whatever it takes. And I'm going to encourage other people to be out front, whatever it takes, because this is the other thing about Operation Rescue. It forced me, and we as a movement tried to force other people to recognize this culture is really sick. There's something very, very wrong. You can't be just good enough. You have to take a stand. You have to work again. You have to swim against the current, or else you're going to be going backwards. You're going to be morally, you're going to be, contributing to the erosion of our society, of our values, of our families, of the world in which your children live. So that was a very important time for me, a very important influence on my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're talking to Phil Lawler here today on this Testimony Tuesday. So much that is relatable, I think, to so many who are probably listening or watching this, including myself. And by the way, you did write a book during that time, which I noticed in your listing here, Operation Rescue: A Challenge to the Nation's Conscience. So that's interesting. But it seems like you were discovering something back then, like 40 years ago, that many of us have kind of discovered maybe over the last 20 years. So you've kind of seen all of this perspective of sort of being awakened to the corruption, the human corruption within the church, the need to really stand up for the truth in bold ways in the public square, and so over the past 40 years, it'd be interesting, I guess, just to ask you for a moment to just share any perspective on that from those times that you went through then to where you are today. Any major lesson you'd want to share with us?
I don't know that there's any particular lesson beyond what I just said, that you have to take a stand. You have to be willing to make sacrifices. One way or another, you are going to pay a price. So do it voluntarily and do it for the right reason. In other words, don't pay the price of having a degraded existence. Pay the price of maybe having a lesser salary or less prestigious job. Pay the price of being less popular. You're not going to be the guy who's invited first to join the country club, but you've got to take a stand, and that has been, I guess, the overriding ambition that I've had in what I've done, writing and speaking and whatnot, for the last 40 years. I think it's pretty consistent, is trying to convince people we're at a historic watershed point, and your grandchildren are going to ask you what you did during these days. And what I was afraid of back in the days of Operation Rescue, what the fear I couldn't get over was the fear of having my grandchildren ask me what I was doing and having to say nothing. I couldn't do that. I had to be able to tell them I did something.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your good work. Anybody who is standing up now, it is folks like Phil Lawler who have really paved the way, and we ought to just be so incredibly grateful for him and for all his good work, and all those like him who have been paving the way on this over the years. It does seem like maybe there are more people standing up now. We still have a long way to go to get a groundswell of people standing up where I think we can really get some movement. Not that we need huge numbers, but we do need more people to say yes, that the Lord can work with. But I guess, I want you to connect the next dots to where you want to go moving forward. But as you do, I guess maybe can you just speak to that as far as, have things seemed in terms of the laity sort of waking up and standing up? Has that gotten any better in your perspective? Where are we at?
It's got better and it's got worse at the same time. You read C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength. Things, I don't know if it's in That Hideous Strength, but things become more what they are, your personality becomes more pronounced as you get old in life, and the same is true of a society. And your strengths and your weaknesses both get easier to see. At least my strengths and weaknesses are easier for me to see, I'll tell you. Probably my weaknesses are much easier for other people to see, my wife particularly. But where was I going with that? I think that there is certainly a movement that's growing of more lay Catholics, and not just Catholics, our brethren in the faith, separated brethren, who are taking a stand, who are willing to sacrifice, and who are speaking out. There's also the frustrating majority, frustrating to me, the majority who aren't, and we need to work on them. But for sure, I find with every passing year, more people who speak my language, who understand what I'm saying and agree, and don't just agree intellectually, but agree with their lives. And that is the way it should be and the way it has to be for a couple of reasons. One is that our way of life is attractive. You know, to live the life of a happy Catholic family is fun. And sure, I have my wife to thank for making our household a great place to live. But I'm not the only one who notices. Our neighbors notice, our friends notice. People come over to our house and they say, I want in. This is how I want to live. It's attractive. To live at one with the precepts of God, which are the precepts of nature, and it's consistent. Your life makes sense. It's attractive to people. And then the other thing that I have remarked on this several times, and you know, I'm waiting for somebody to contradict me, but it's been it's been about 40 years now since I decided I was going to try to get to Mass every day. And in those 40 years, we've lived in several different places. I think I counted 10 different parishes or chapels or shrines where I would regularly go to Mass. In every one of those places, the number of people going to daily Mass has increased while I've been there. Every one. Now, you know why that's particularly remarkable is when I got there in every place, most of the people were pretty old. So they're dying off or moving to Florida. And yet more people are in the pews. Every place, there are a lot of people making the commitment to get to Mass every day. And that sure is, surely that's one of the indicators that tells you something is happening. And it happens every year, you know. We're coming up towards Lent now as we're recording this. And every year there are people who obviously make the sacrifice to try to get to Mass every day during Lent. Well, every year when Lent ends, some of them keep coming. And it's growing. There's no question that the Spirit is moving in that way. It's not moving fast enough to keep me happy, but then it takes a lot to keep me happy. So.
Yes, Phil Lawler is with us, and yeah, that's a good context to explain, you know, as you were moving forward in your good work in your life, and I'd say that's pretty good context to explain what I'm striving to do with participating with God's grace and do some good work with my life as well. I think we're very much seeing things the same way, and so you were combating the human corruption within the church to some degree, but also seeing that work needed to be done in terms of the state, and you decided to stand up and dive into that as well. Anything you want to share about that, even yourself becoming a candidate for U.S. Senate in 2000, running against Senator Ted Kennedy, that must have been quite an experience. Anything you want to share from it?
That was an instance where I said, look, somebody has to run against Kennedy, and I didn't see anybody doing it, at least not for the right reasons. And some friends said, well, why don't you? And I was at a stage in my life, probably that was my midlife crisis, where I said, well, why not? It was fun in a way. I mean, of course I didn't have a chance. And I knew that. And most of the people who supported me knew that. But I wanted to give people an opportunity to make a vote that they'd be proud of. And I will say this, and it is consistent. I'm glad you asked the question because it is consistent with what we were just saying. When I was speaking on the campaign trail, the most common response that I got was from people who said, I didn't know I could say that. I didn't know, I didn't know there was anybody out there who thought like me. So in a sense, I was, the way the pop psychologists say, I was giving them permission to think what they already thought, but to say it out loud, and I'm very glad I did that. It was sort of putting my life on hold for about a year, my career on hold for about a year. It was a good experience. Sometimes I think I should put my recollections in a book, but that was the most important thing I got out of it, was recognizing, well, that and also meeting some wonderful people. I've been very blessed in my life. The number of wonderful people that I've met. I've met a couple of saints. I've met a pope, and I've met a lot of people who are doing God's work in different ways. And that is always edifying.
Yeah, we are so blessed to have Phil Lawler with us, sharing some of his personal testimony here today. One more segment to go. After this break, we're going to give the floor completely to Phil. Anything else that he wants to share with us today. But I don't know if you're experiencing the same thing as me as we listen to Phil share some stories with us today, but just incredibly grateful for him, for his yes, for all those like him over the past decades who have been saying yes and fighting the good fight, standing up with the virtue of fortitude and forging the way and giving people the courage to, yes, stand up as well when we see that good example. We'll be right back with Phil Lawler. Stay tuned.
What you're offering and giving to me, you deserve to get back, because you're offering more than I can give.
I learned so much through the Station on the Cross. I listen to the radio station daily, and I absolutely love it.
I was attending the chapel and places like that, and through your programs, I was able to find out how other Protestants had come back into the Catholic Church. God bless the Station of the Cross.
Donate today at thestationofthecross.com.
The Station of the Cross is listener-funded, and we value your ongoing generosity. In this fast-paced world, it's easy to let your recurring donation slip due to something like a new address or a card number change. If you suspect that we might not have your up-to-date donor information, you can check with us during regular business hours at 1-877-888-6279 extension 104, or anytime online at thestationofthecross.com.
Here at the Station of the Cross, we proudly bring the truths of the Catholic faith to countless listeners through radio and mobile devices, and we're grateful for the feedback we've received.
I grew up Catholic Church, haven't been in the Catholic Church for decades, but I'm in the process of working my way back for the simple reason that I needed a place to listen to pro-life, pro-family messages. Catholic radio is it. It's a place to hear that message without all the political bias and all that that's going on News Talk Radio.
It changed my life.
It's the only station I turn on.
The Catholic station is an answer to prayer.
It couldn't be more fulfilling.
It's helped me learn more about the faith, and it's helped me to deepen my faith as a result of that.
It's on continuously in my house, day and night. You can't imagine how much I receive from that channel.
If you've been blessed by listening to the Station of the Cross, let us know. Call 1-877-888-6279, extension 112. Then share your testimonial with us.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here. Phil Lawler is our guest today. Testimony Tuesday, sharing some of his personal testimony with us on the reality of Jesus and his Catholic Church, sharing some of the good work that he's done in his life with participation by God's grace, all by God's grace, all for God's glory. And Phil has shared a lot with us already, but in this final segment, Phil, the floor is yours. Anything else that you want to share with us, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Well, we're more or less on schedule. We were up to the point where I had left the pilot. I had been involved in Operation Rescue. And then the next thing that I think would be very important in my life was I became editor of Catholic World Report, which was an international monthly news magazine. And that was, well, there's a lot I could say about that, but the particular thing I want to bring out is that Catholic World Report was way ahead of everybody, pretty much, in exploring the clerical sex abuse problem. We were on the case 10 years before the Boston Globe blew open the story in Boston. And I was exploring that, the corruption of the clergy. And that had, for sure, it was a test of faith. Because I saw that there were a lot of priests involved in this horrendous activity. A small percentage of the number of the priests, but still a horribly large number. And that shocked me, but I understood because it's sin, and I understand sin. The Catholic Church is an expert on sin. What shocked me even more and shook my faith more was learning that most bishops, not a few bishops, most bishops covered up the evidence, that they protected the abusers rather than the abused. And that, to me, was just such clear evidence of a warped sense of what they were doing, a warped sense of what the church is and how they serve the church, corruption in their understanding of the church. And I wrote my book about that, The Faithful Departed, which was based on the crisis in Boston and how it showed the corruption that I came to believe that the sex abuse crisis was a symptom of a deeper disease, a disease that's been in the church for a long time, a corruption. It's a crisis of faith. And then I have to move forward to almost our current time and tell you the next real jolt that I got, which to me was a greater test of faith than the sex abuse crisis. And that was the COVID shutdown. Because then our bishops, our pastors, our shepherds closed the doors of the church, turned off the sacramental life of the church. I still cannot get over that. How could this happen? But again, I see it as the only explanation that I can come up with is that this is a corruption of the faith, a misunderstanding of what it means to be a church. Because if I believed that I was in serious danger of dying, which frankly I never did believe, the very first thing I would want was the sacraments. And yet they were being denied to me and denied to people who were dying. And it's just a terrible tragedy that I think we haven't worked our way through yet. And my book, Contagious Faith, which you were kind enough to show to the audience, is a reflection on this, on the idea that in a time of crisis, the church should stand out as a source of help for people, for sure, a source of material help, but more important, a source of spiritual help, which you must have. And it's much more important to have the spiritual health. That's the role of the church. Let others worry about the physical health, which obviously we all care about it. But as church, we have to say that the spiritual health comes first. So that has been the biggest crisis of my recent past. And honestly, as I say, it's a bigger crisis of faith for me than the sex abuse crisis, even though I spent years diving in that muck, and that really took a toll. But well, you can see I'm still having trouble getting over how is it that our church is shut down? How could that have happened? Mm-hmm. And I think we need to come to terms with that.
Yeah. Again, the book is Contagious Faith, Why the Church Must Spread Hope, Not Fear in a Pandemic. And Phil wrote this, again, published 2021, Crisis Publications. And I remember at the time in 2021, we did have Phil on and have an interview with him, again, back in the archives of the podcast. If you go in, you can find it. In fact, just hearing Phil talk a little bit about it, I want to go back and listen to that and find out what lessons he drew out for us. But the book is a great one because, as we get away from that time, you can kind of forget exactly what the details were of how everything went down and what lessons we need to learn from that. Again, the book Contagious Faith by Phil Lawler, very, very helpful. All right, our last few minutes here, Phil, anything else that you want to make sure to share with us today?
Just this, you have been very kind talking about how much I've done and how grateful people should be for me. I don't know that people should be grateful for me. What I've done, they should be grateful to our Lord for giving us the job. I have done a lousy job. The best that I can say is I hope that people will say, at least he tried. At least you know which side he was on. And that's such an important question for all of us to ask ourselves is, which side are you on? We're in a society that's falling apart. And we're in the midst of a culture war, and it's taking huge, huge tolls. And which side are you on? And very often people will say, well, the Catholic Church, yes, we've had problems. We're losing people, but that's because of the culture. Well, yeah, it's because of the culture, but why is the culture falling apart? Why isn't the church shaping the culture? Instead, why is the church being shaped by the culture? Again, which side are you on? Are you side of the culture or the side of the church? I think that's the question that I've been trying to pose to people throughout my career is that question. Choose sides, and which side are you on? And as the late Midge Decter said, join the team that you're on.
Yeah, Phil Lawler, and let me ask you this before we wrap up here. As far as a message, taking that message that you just shared so eloquently and maybe directing it specifically towards men, the fact that men really need to take their place in terms of leadership, in terms of taking responsibility and repenting of what we've done, what we haven't done, making a new resolve to do more with respect to church and state, especially with respect to the daily ongoing mass murder of the preborn. Any message specifically to men?
Yes. You're in charge of your family first. You're in charge of protecting your family, and your family needs protection because your family, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren are facing very powerful negative forces. Men have dropped the ball so much today. I mean, the feminist movement is testimony to the fact that we as men have not done our jobs in protecting our women from the influences that are battering on them. I mean, young married women need help. They need your help. They need the help of their husbands, their fathers, their grandfathers, their boyfriends, their brothers. We need to come to their aid.
Yes, thank you, Phil Lawler, for coming on, saying yes to do this today, sharing with us, also for all of your good work. I want to encourage people to go out and find his writings, articles, books, essays. They're out there, including Contagious Faith, but check out everything. Founder and editor of Catholic World News. Again, headline news coverage there at CatholicCulture.org, CatholicCulture.org, and share this episode with folks. This is one to really encourage and inspire. Let us, hopefully, I think at the end we probably will all say we did a lousy job, but hopefully by God's grace we were on the right side, and we're going to hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant. God bless you.